the tournament that we played in, all the games were played in the Boston Garden. The last night when we won the championship of what was called the Tech Tournament, what I remember, first of all, is winning in front of a sellout crowd. There were 13,909 people.
Wow.
I remember the crowd storming the floor, us cutting down the nets. And then after the game, there was a tradition that had been established years before, and that was if you won the championship, you got to ride on top of the fire engines.
Wow.
Through the city of Cambridge. We took the championship ride on the top of fire engines all through Cambridge. So we went through our neighborhood and all through the city at around midnight after winning the championship.
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
So I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you made the pass, yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 82. Thanks for joining me. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome coaching luminary Mike Jarvis to the show. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did recording it. We cover Mike's career in basketball and life in general. He also shares some great stories from the numerous years he mentored and coached a young Patrick Ewing. Truly fascinating. Show notes for this episode, including links to numerous topics covered, are at inallairness.com/82. Now, onto the show. My guest today has a storied life in basketball. As a high school coach, he mentored Patrick Ewing and led his team to 3 consecutive state championships before embarking on 25 seasons as a Division I head coach, leading 3 universities to the NCAA tournament and 9 appearances in all. Mike Jarvis, thank you very much for joining me.
It is my pleasure.
I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today. We have been corresponding a bit in the last few days, and I've learned a lot about your career, and I'm looking forward to expounding on that now. You attended, at the time, it was called Rindge Technical High School in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
It is. It's Rindge and Latin High School. There used to be 2 high schools. I went to Rindge Tech as a high schooler. My wife went to High and Latin. They merged the 2 high schools. So they put the 2 high schools together, and they kept basically both names, Rindge and Latin. So it became Cambridge, Rindge, and Latin High School.
I've read that you were a basketballer and a baseballer.
Mm-hmm.
What led to your decision to focus on basketball?
Well, actually, I played basketball, baseball, and football.
Oh, and football as well.
I broke my ankle as a freshman playing football, so I gave that sport up immediately and concentrated on basketball and baseball. I was a better baseball player. I was a catcher.
Okay.
But I was not very good at hitting the curveball. So eventually that eliminated me from baseball, and I eventually concentrated more on basketball.
Aha, okay, I've got it. And I also read that in 1962, Cambridge was Class A Eastern Massachusetts champion. You had a 22-2 record. So what do you actually remember of that stellar season?
Well, first of all, the year before we had lost in the playoffs in the tournament in the Boston Garden. So we came back as seniors. My teammates and I determined that we were going to be the best team in Massachusetts. And we were. We had the best player in Massachusetts, a young man by the name of Larry Stead. His nickname was Leader. He was our team leader. He was our team's highest scorer and rebounder. And he was my buddy, my lifelong friend from my neighborhood.
Ah, fantastic. When you were a senior then and you got to have that great season, what are a couple of memories that you may have from that time, and especially playing in Boston Garden, which I believe you did play in the Garden numerous times throughout your high school career as well?
Yes, we did. In fact, the tournament that we played in, all the games were played in the Boston Garden. And the last night when we won the championship of what was called the Tech Tournament, What I remember, first of all, is winning in front of a sellout crowd. There were 13,909 people.
Wow.
I remember the crowd storming the floor, us cutting down the nets. And then after the game, there was a tradition that had been established years before. And that was if you won the tech tourney, if you won the championship, you got to ride on top of the fire engines.
Wow.
Through the city of Cambridge. We took the championship ride on the top of fire engines all through Cambridge. So we went through our neighborhood and all through the city at around midnight after winning the championship.
Oh, that's fantastic. Do you have any photos that were taken of that particular time?
Oh, no, I wish we did. Back then, the photos that we might have been able to take back then were the Polaroid instant photos. But for whatever reason, there were never any photos that I ever saw of our championship ride on the fire engines.
It sounds like a fantastic memory, though, and what an experience as well after having played in the Boston Garden and then winning that tournament too. So great memories indeed. After your high school career, you attended Northeastern University, and your coach there was a guy by the name of Dukeshire?
Correct. Dick Dukeshire, yeah.
That was in the mid-1960s, and the school records indicated that your team improved markedly from your sophomore through senior seasons, and you went from 13 to 18 and then 22 wins, respectively. When you look back on your college experience, where academically you completed a bachelor's degree in physical education, what are some of the things that spring to mind most when you think about Northeastern, Mike?
Well, what I think about is I had a great coach, a great teacher. Dick Dukeshire actually was the person that really developed international basketball in Greece. He was like the architect of basketball for Greece when he left Northeastern. So he was a great teacher, very fundamental coach, taught us how to play. I had never really been taught the fundamentals of the game. We won in high school just because of our talent. So I learned that there was much more than just how fast you could run or how high you could jump. It was really about the techniques and the fundamentals of basketball. So I learned the fundamentals from him. I also want to mention that I was very frustrated as a sophomore, and I quit the basketball team as a sophomore.
All right.
And yeah, I was living at home, and my brother and father had a fish and chip store. So I went back and cooked in the fish and chip store. My brother talked me into going back and apologizing and asking the coach for a second chance. So I did that. He let me try out again the next year. I made the team. I still didn't play a lot, but that's when I decided that I wanted to be a coach. So I tried to learn as much as I could from him. And eventually he hired me as an assistant coach.
So there's a chance that perhaps had you not been coerced by your brother to head back and make that apology, that you might not have even continued to finish your time at Northeastern, let alone go on to have that career and life in basketball that you've had to date.
There's no doubt about it. I owe so much to my brother. He knew how much I loved to play, and he knew how important it was to me. And that, when I finally realized that I wasn't as good as I thought I was and wanted to be a coach, he knew I had to go back. Plus, he knew what a good coach I had in Coach Dukeshire.
Now, if my timeline's correct, and as you did mention, you then went on to be an assistant coach at Northeastern through the 1973 season. Towards the end of that tenure, you also were associated with the legendary Jim Calhoun, who was then head coach. All the while, you were a high school physical education teacher as well.
Yes.
How did you adjust to becoming a coach, and also you're a newly minted teacher, and all these obligations are all at the same time?
Well, I don't know. Somehow, the good Lord, just gave me the strength. My high school sweetheart and we got married in my senior year in college. And really, she was the one that was able to make my dreams come true. And she supported me, and she worked when I was in school as a senior. And I wouldn't have ever been able to even try to do half of the things that I did if it wasn't for my wife, Connie.
Oh, fantastic. Most listeners would know that Jim Calhoun would then go on to enjoy tremendous success at the University of Connecticut for well over 25 years.
Correct.
So that's a really interesting start to your coaching career in amongst doing that work with teaching as well. Now, following your time with Northeastern, you joined Harvard University's coaching staff, and at the time they were led by 8-time NBA champion of the Boston Celtics, Tom Satch Sanders.
That's correct.
Can you describe the impact that these future basketball Hall of Famers in Calhoun and Sanders would actually have on your own coaching ideals, Mike?
Well, first of all, I owe Jim Calhoun a lot of credit for keeping me on his staff when he took over the job at Northeastern. So he made it possible for me to continue to coach. When I went to Harvard, it was an opportunity to be able to coach at a college that was within a 10-minute walk from my high school. So I would teach at the high school in the morning, and then I would walk through the Harvard yard over to the gym where I would coach with Satch. And I mean, he was such a great person. And obviously he had learned from my childhood hero, Red Auerbach. And in fact, Red Auerbach used to come to a lot of our practices. So I got to really get to know him. And the great thing about Satch, he was such a quiet person that he needed somebody like me to do the yelling. So I was the designated yeller, and I worked with him while I coached the freshman team. So I coached the freshman team like around 3, and then I would assist him with the varsity team around 5:30. So I had actually my job in the morning teaching, and then I coached 2 teams at Harvard, the freshman, and I assisted him with the varsity.
Okay, so you're a very busy man, to say the least.
Oh, yes, to say the least.
Yeah. So you mentioned Red Auerbach there and how he was an idol of yours as you were growing up. How present was he in your basketball circles throughout the 1970s?
Well, he basically became a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Later, he would become one of my mentors. See, I grew up, my brother, Richard, used to take me to the Celtics games. He would save up enough money to buy 2 tickets, one for him and one for me. And in fact, the first game I ever saw with my brother in the Boston Garden was Bill Russell's first game in the NBA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I was a Celtics fan during all of those championship years. I want to say they won like 11 out of 12 championships. And the only year they lost was when Bill Russell sprained his ankle against the St. Louis Hawks. So when I used to go to the games and watch the Celtics, I think I spent a lot of my time watching Red Auerbach coach. And that's why I say he was definitely my coaching hero throughout my life.
That's absolutely fascinating. So if I have my timeline correct as well, just with what I remember, Bill Russell, he started his rookie season late because he was actually over here in Australia at the 1956 Olympics.
That's right. Yeah. I was in the 6th grade when my brother took me to my first professional game. And I think that was Bill Russell's first game in the Boston Garden. They played against the Philadelphia Warriors. I think the Philadelphia Warriors at that time, it was before Wilt Chamberlain, they had a center by the name of Neil Johnson. If you look it up, I think Bill Russell had somewhere around 40 rebounds that first night.
I will try to check that out as we continue our conversation.
Okay.
That's just some fantastic and really intriguing background there as to what led to your rise in coaching. And, of course, some very strong backgrounds there with guys including Red Auerbach and Dick Dukeshire and, of course, Jim Calhoun and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Before we actually chat about your amazing success at Cambridge High School, how did that actual head coaching position at your alma mater present itself? Because I believe there were some interesting circumstances behind that coming to be.
There were, as you had mentioned before, I started out teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I was also an assistant coach at Northeastern for 5 years, and Harvard for 4 years. So 9 years had passed. I had given up all hope of being the head coach at the high school, which is the job I first wanted when I came out of college. And I was scheduled to become the head coach at Harvard when Satch left to become the assistant with the Celtics. So I thought I was going to get the Harvard job. I didn't get the Harvard job. What I got booted out the door, so I was out of coaching. The 1971-72 season, I believe, I was out of coaching altogether. Later that next year, the high school job was open. They had a policy back then where every year the high school job was a renewable job, and the high school team did not live up to what the city's expectations were. They had a very good year, but they didn't win the championship. So some of the members of the community got a petition wanting me to be named coach. I eventually was named the coach by a 4-3 vote from the school committee. So I became the coach. I think it was 1977, I believe.
Well, what an incredible turn of events for that to actually come to be, and such a close 4-3 vote as well.
Yeah.
And that, again, hinged on your possible continuing your coaching career.
That's right.
When you think about it, so many different machinations of what could have been. But
oh, yeah.
That then led to, I think it was 7 seasons that you spent coaching them?
Yes, 7 seasons at the high school.
An incredible record at one stage, we'll get to in just a moment, which was 77-1.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Jamaican-born figure who looms large in Cambridge's extraordinary success, and that's, of course, Patrick Ewing. Before we even just get to your association with Patrick, what sort of strategies were you looking to implement, and how did you intend to get the team to go forward and have the success that obviously the city almost demanded?
They did demand it. The year before I came, they had already lost 2 games. And I think they lost those 2 games by a total of maybe 3 points. So they almost had an undefeated season, but it wasn't good enough. And there were some people that thought that I was, the best person for the job. So anyhow, fortunately for me, 4 years prior to that, I had my first encounter with Patrick Ewing when he first came from Jamaica as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old. His phys ed teacher was a football coach, didn't know a lot about basketball. So he asked me to work with Patrick and try to teach him the fundamentals of the game, which I did. I didn't know that 4 years later I would be coaching him in high school, but that's how God works. So when I took the team over, Patrick was going into his sophomore year. He was still very thin, but he had grown to be about 6'9", 6'10". You could see that he was going to be pretty daggone good. And every year he got better and better and better. And the thing about Patrick, he was always the first person to practice, the last person to leave. He was an incredibly smart player. He knew what everyone was supposed to do on the floor, and he didn't care about scoring. All he wanted to do was win first. The player that I wanted to model him after was Bill Russell. It was amazing that the guy that I grew up idolizing, I ended up getting a player that would become the best player in America and the most dominant center in America, in Patrick Ewing.
It truly is fantastic. As I was researching, I was enjoying it so much. As you mentioned, Patrick moved from Jamaica to the Boston area in mid-1970s.
Mm-hmm.
His mother had actually arrived in Massachusetts a few years earlier, from what I understand, and then Patrick came across.
Yes.
How did you handle the process of developing trust with Patrick and his family? What was that process like?
Well, Patrick trusted me because his mother trusted me. Patrick's mother was from Jamaica, from the West Indies. My wife, her mother was born in the West Indies, in Barbados.
Oh.
So when Mrs. Ewing came to Cambridge, she got to be friendly with my wife's mother. And my wife also got to be friendly with Mrs. Ewing, and they would talk about some of the different food dishes, particularly the rice dishes that they would make, and the curried chicken and all that. So there was a bond between the women. And Mrs. Ewing trusted me so much that she basically put all of the basketball and affairs in my hands. And she basically told me to handle everything. So fortunately for me, I had coached at the collegiate level. I had also learned a lot from how Lou Alcindor, before he became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar when he was in high school, about his recruitment. So we were able to put together a very unique, one-of-a-kind model of how the best player in America should be recruited. And so the recruitment was very, very orderly. Every school just about in America wanted to recruit Patrick. We narrowed down the choices eventually to schools that would fit his needs. And I think there were 16 schools that came in for visits. And then we selected 6 schools that he would visit. and then ultimately and eventually he picked Georgetown.
I was just fascinated when I read that about the process that was involved. That was with Ewing's junior high school coach, Steve Jenkins, and yourself. Is that correct?
Yes. He was his phys ed teacher, the guy who brought him to the gym when he first came.
Oh, okay. That's the same gentleman. Wow.
The same gentleman who was a very good friend of his. We had a committee, two of my assistants, Al Coccaluto, who would eventually become the coach at Rindge after I left, and Vin Milley were part of the committee along with Steve. So we had a group of 5 people that basically would interview the coaches when they came to visit.
Right. Okay. And according to a Jackie McMullen Boston Globe article that I read, the actual news conference to announce Patrick's choice of Georgetown took place at Satch Sanders' restaurant.
That is correct. Yes. Satch obviously was a good friend. He had just opened up a restaurant in Boston, and we decided that would be a great place to hold the press conference.
Incredible. Do you remember much about the actual day itself when Patrick did front the media? Obviously, he was a shy and somewhat reserved person in front of the cameras, but you know him away from the cameras and the limelight, how he might have been, and he seemed to be such an endearing character.
Yes.
Do you mind just sort of talking about that particular day where he had to front the media and announce where he was heading to, and of course, that he didn't stay in the New England area? It did have an impact on even those that were in attendance. Some of them actually walked away at the time when they heard his announcement. Yes,
they did. The schools that he visited at the time, Dr. Tom Davis was coaching at Boston College. Rick Pitino was coaching at Boston University. North Carolina was another school where Dean Smith was coaching. UCLA, where Larry Brown was coaching. Villanova, where Rolly Massimino was coaching. Those were the schools that Patrick narrowed his choices down to. I think everybody thought that he was going to go to Boston College. And when he announced that he was going to go to Georgetown and play for John Thompson, that didn't sit too well, especially, with Georgetown being in the Big East with Boston College. And yes, a lot of Boston people left that day, very disappointed. In fact, a lot of people in Massachusetts, and you can't blame them, they were really, really upset with his choice.
Yeah, really an intriguing period of time. And unfortunately, that seemed to have further repercussions for the remainder of his high school games, where there were certain signs that would go up in the crowd as well, which were very distasteful to say the absolute least. And then again, even into some of his college games at Georgetown. What did you make of the racial divide or the tensions in Massachusetts around that period of time there, Mike?
Boston was really divided. Bill Russell had lots of problems that people never ever knew about when he came with the Celtics. And it was always a very difficult place for blacks to, live and to really advance, to be honest with you. The city of Boston itself was very divided. Fortunately, we were in Cambridge, which is across the river and not really part of Boston. We're our own city. But Boston at that time was going through forced busing where kids were being bused because of the, just the racial climate. They were being bused from one part of the city to another. That was not taking place in Cambridge. Boston could be a rough place. And, like I said, when Patrick decided that he wasn't going to go to Boston College, then he became public enemy number one.
Terrible, some of the things that actually happened around that period of time.
Yeah, like you said, there were nights when we had bricks thrown through our bus windows, our tires slashed at the games. There was one night, I remember, where some of the opposing fans dressed up in gorilla outfits and threw banana peelings on the floor.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, it was. But, I think what it did for us and for Patrick, we never ever let our guard down, and we were ready all the time. I mean, it made us tougher, stronger, and certainly sharper.
Well, that almost answered the next question that sprung to mind, and that was, how did it affect your team in general, not just Patrick himself, of course, who had his own ways of dealing with things, and I think he did a really good job from all reports as far as blocking things out and just keeping to himself as best possible. But it certainly shed some light on some of the things that he had to endure and you had to endure throughout your time there as well. Changing pace completely, Patrick would wear a T-shirt under his Hoyas jersey when he played in college. And I was aware of that, but I wasn't aware that that actual trend began as far back as his junior season in high school.
As you mentioned, we lost one game in high school with Patrick, and that was in his junior year. We took our school bus and went to New Haven, Connecticut, where we met the state champions of Connecticut, Wilbur-Cross High School. And it was a snowy winter night. And when we got to the game, Patrick had been feeling ill and he was running a fever, but yet, you couldn't keep him out of the game. Throughout the game, probably about every 5 minutes, he would sweat through his T-shirt and put on a new one. He initially wore the first T-shirt because he was not feeling well and running a little bit of a fever. And so we brought a bag full of T-shirts. And by the end of the night, I think he had gone through the whole bag of T-shirts. School colors were brown and gold, and we had all these gold T-shirts that he totally soaked completely through. And to be honest with you, because it was Massachusetts, similar to maybe Great Britain, the English weather was kind of cold and damp and snowy in the winter. And Patrick liked the feel of the T-shirt, so he kept wearing the T-shirt even after that game. And when he went to college, he wore a T-shirt. And John Thompson, who was with Nike at the time, said, "Ha, we'll have the Nike swoosh on the T-shirt." And that's when that began really the T-shirt craze in America.
Yeah, that's true. I really appreciate you opening up about not only just that great little tidbit there, but of course the previous, when we were chatting about some of the downtimes and off the court scenarios there. But it's great to sort of hear you talk about these things you've experienced.
Sure.
Guys like Chris Mullen, I know Chris Mullen wore a T-shirt on and off throughout his career at St. John's.
Yes, he did.
It certainly started a trend that, and you'd have to say that Patrick was right up there with the one who first began that trend.
Yes, he was. And I'm not saying he was the only one. Of course, when I tell the story, I make it sound like, nobody wore a T-shirt. But there were a few guys, especially in the Northeast, that wore T-shirts.
It's a fascinating little tidbit there. In May of 1980, Patrick was invited to Team USA's Olympic trials in Kentucky.
Correct.
I've read that you were there with him, at least for part of that time.
I was a part of the staff, the coaching staff. I was selected to be an assistant at the trials. And to be honest with you, the main reason why I was selected was because I was Patrick's high school coach and they wanted Patrick. So Patrick and I went together and, I assisted Dave Gavitt, who was the head coach at that time.
Can you recall watching Patrick competing against guys who were probably at least 2 or 3, maybe more years his senior?
Oh, yeah.
And obviously would go on to be future NBA stars. Like, how did he match up as a much younger guy who was still developing his enormous potential?
Well, at that time, they didn't have the pros playing. So he was playing against guys who were going into their junior and senior years in college. So they were basically 4 years older than Patrick. And also 50, 60 pounds heavier. He did well, but he didn't dominate there. He was like another guy there. What he did learn was how much stronger and how much better he had to be, because the older players like Bill Laimbeer, they didn't care how young he was. They treated him as if he was a college player. There were a couple of times when he actually got in a couple of fights.
Wow.
With Laimbeer and a few of the other guys.
Laimbeer.
Because he wouldn't back down from anybody.
Well, that would have been interesting to see if any footage of that exists. But, they go on to battle for many years.
Yes.
How was the response from those in the city to that incredible success of 3 straight state championships? And once Patrick had finished his high school days, how did you readjust the team? Because you were still with the squad through another 3 or 4 seasons beyond that.
Yes, I was. The city, they couldn't be more proud of their team, a team that brought national recognition. They loved it, and so did I. And we developed a great basketball program with youngsters. We started, in fact, the year that I was out of coaching, I started a youth basketball program called Shoot Straight, a co-ed program. And what happened was my players used to actually coach the younger kids. So my players were serving as leaders and mentors for the younger kids in Cambridge. So everybody wanted to play for the high school. And after Patrick left, we had 1 year, which we were sort of like just okay. We had a couple years where we were decent. And then we became great again because one of those players that was in our youth program developed into a first-team All-American at the high school, and that was Ramil Robinson, who went on to be first-team All-American and lottery draft pick and national champion at Michigan. So I got a chance to help develop and bring him along. And he played for me. He started for me as a freshman, played 2 more seasons, and he was going into his last year of high school when I took the Boston University job. Him and my son were playing together at that time.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. He was probably the next greatest player after Patrick to play at the high school.
Ramil's also Jamaican born as well, isn't he?
That's right. He had moved to Cambridge, and you got to understand now Cambridge, and the reason why the Jamaican, the West Indian folks moved to Cambridge was because we had a very large population from the West Indies. So folks felt very comfortable. They could get jobs, come in and acclimate to the culture and to Cambridge very easily. And they had family usually and friends living in the city. So Ramil, I think, came from Jamaica maybe when he was around 7 or 8 years of age.
In April of 1981, it was after those 3 consecutive state championships, you coached in the McDonald's High School All-American game.
Yes.
Took place in Wichita, Kansas. And you led the East team, which was packed with some future NBA stars, such as Michael Jordan, Chris Mullin, Bill Wennington, just to name a few.
Yeah, just to name a few.
And the West team included an upcoming guest of this show, Sam Vincent.
Yes.
Enos Watley and Greg Dreiling.
Right.
And a former guest, a great friend of the show, Nigel Miguel, was also part of the Western team.
All great guys.
Your East team held on to win 96-95. That was behind 30 points from Michael Jordan, who also made 2 free throws with 11 seconds left to help secure the win.
Yes.
All that said, it's a long preamble, but there's next to no video footage that exists from that All-American game. Therefore, any memories that you're willing to share would be obviously most appreciated.
Yeah, well, that was an experience of a lifetime. I was selected to coach that team. I was also given the responsibility of selecting my assistant. I chose my 12-year-old son to be my assistant coach.
I was going to ask about that. I saw a team photo that actually says Mike Jarvis Jr., assistant coach.
That's right. And he took his job seriously. And I'll tell you a story that was incredible. So we go out to Wichita. This was before Facebook and Twitter and all of this other stuff. So I didn't know who these players were. I had never heard of Michael Jordan before. I heard a little bit about Chris Mullin, but, high school players didn't get the kind of publicity that they do now. So I get this team. And the other thing that's kind of important here is that Patrick Ewing had already played in his 2 All-Star games. You could only play in 2 postseason All-Star games. So he had played in the Dapper Dan and in the Classic in D.C. So he couldn't play in the game. He did come out to Wichita to be honored as a member of the McDonald's All-American team, but he couldn't play. We went from what would have been a good-sized team to being an undersized team. In fact, even though we had our guards, Michael Jordan and Buzz Peterson and Adrian Branch, they were all about 6'6", 6'7", but we only had one really big guy, and that was Bill Wennington. The West squad had 3 or 4 guys that were around 7 feet tall. So we were the smaller team, but I think that helped us because we became the quicker team. And Michael Jordan was incredible. In fact, he made the last, I want to say he's probably scored the last 12 points for us. And I knew if we had the ball last that we would win the game. And sure enough, the game was tied and Michael got fouled and he made the free throws. But during that game, let me tell you a story that, and this was the night I knew that my 12-year-old son was going to be a coach. The game had barely begun and he was sitting next to me like, he did throughout our career together. And he nudged me in the side with his little elbow and he says, "Hey, Dad, we got to get him out the game. And I said, who? He says, Adrian Branch. He's not playing any defense. And I looked out and I said, you know what, Mike? You're right. So I took Adrian out the game, and Adrian was not happy. And he went storming down the end of the bench and sat himself down the chair. And my son, a couple of seconds later, got up out of his chair, and he went down, he kneeled in front of Adrian, and he said, Adrian, if you don't play defense, my dad ain't going to put you back in. So Adrian Branch almost fell out of his chair.
I can imagine.
Oh, Mike came back, sat back down. About a minute or 2 minutes later, he hit me again with an elbow, and he says, hey, let's give Adrian another shot.
Oh.
I said, why not? So I put Adrian back in the game. Adrian played his butt off. He ended up actually winning the MVP, even though Michael should have, but he played a great game. We won that game because of the team effort and also because of my son getting under the skin of Adrian Branch and getting him to play some defense.
That is so good. I love that story. Thank you very much for sharing that. Do you mind just talking about the impact that your son, Mike Jr., would obviously have and the journey that you shared together through many years in the coaching ranks? Of course, that might have been his entry to coaching, but it would go on to be quite a stellar effort for him as well over many years.
Well, you know, I'm looking at a picture of he and I coaching one of our last games as we speak, and I was at Boston University. He was going into his, I want to say his sophomore year, and I took the head coaching job at George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to come with me. I said, no, you're staying here at Boston. You'll get your degree here and you'll play here. So he stayed at BU. But when he graduated, he wanted to be a coach. I had an opening on my staff, and obviously I hired him. I knew how good he was and how good he would be. And in 1993, we became the first black father-son coaching team, first African-American, whatever term you want to use,
mm-hmm.
father-son coaching team in Division I college basketball. In fact, that first year when we were together, we went to the Sweet 16 at George Washington, and we played against the Michigan Fab Five and almost beat them. Then he went with me to St. John's, and when I was out of coaching after St. John's, between St. John's and Florida Atlantic, Mike went and worked for a couple of years at Duke with Mike Krzyzewski. When I went back into coaching at Florida Atlantic, Mike said, Dad, I want to work with you again, and he came and worked with me again. So we've coached our first game together during the 92-93 season at GW, and we coached our last game together during the 2013-14 season at Florida Atlantic.
Just fantastic memories, and it's really great to hear you speak obviously so lovingly of your son and his importance that he's had in, of course, your time professionally and obviously away from the court too.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, rounding out your time at Rindge High School, 3 times you were actually named Massachusetts High School Coach of the Year, which is an incredible achievement. Did those honors also coincide with the 3 state titles, or were they spread out?
They coincided with the titles, and I really think in a way they did it the right way. Whichever team won the championship, that coach would normally be named Coach of the Year. I always thought that, you know, the Coach of the Year should have won a championship, and it just so happened that that's the way they did it in Massachusetts back then.
On the tail end of that, then you were offered the opportunity to become head coach at the college level, and this time it was a move to Boston University. What were the circumstances that led to you heading to the college side of things, Mike?
There were a few things. One, I really wanted a new challenge. That was number one, and it's not often, especially back then, very few African Americans were head coaches in college. In fact, when I went to college, I became one of 16, and 8 of those coaches were at the predominantly black schools. So there were only 8 coaches in the whole country out of almost 300 that, you know, were African American. So it was a great honor.
Mm.
The other thing is that when I went to coach at BU, both of my children, my son and my daughter, were advancing in high school, and I was able to negotiate with the president of the university a full scholarship for both of my kids. So When I look back now, it was probably from a financial standpoint. I know I would not have been able to send both of my kids to Boston University. Mike eventually got a basketball scholarship, but they both were admitted to BU on scholarships.
That's fantastic. Was it at Boston University where you would obtain your master's in education?
That year I was out of coach and I began the process. And the year before I actually went to coach at Boston University, I got my master's degree in education.
That's another great achievement to add to the collection. Now, we're talking 1985-86 was your first season with BU, and in 5 seasons, you led the team to the National Invitational Tournament in 86. You won 2 conference championships in 88 and 90, and then made 2 NCAA tournament appearances, also in 88 and 90. And on top of that, you surpassed Rick Pitino to become BU's most winningest coach at that time as well. Again, the achievements continue to roll on. A fantastic first 5 seasons of coaching at that level. What are your thoughts on that first foray into head coaching at college?
Well, the advantage that I had was that I had worked as an assistant for 9 years under 2 really exceptional coaches. It wasn't like I was just becoming a college coach from being a high school coach. I had been a college coach already. I was prepared for it. And what coaching in high school did for me was really just solidify the fact that I was a teacher first, and that the game and the things I learned from both Calhoun and Tom Sanders was to keep the game simple. And same thing that Red Auerbach did. So I was prepared when I went to college to be a head coach because of the experiences I had before. Plus, my high school team was not an ordinary high school team. We could have beat a lot of colleges back then. I was well prepared.
Moving on beyond Boston University, you were the head coach at George Washington University for 8 seasons. That was 1991 through 1998. And you enjoyed some great success during that period. There was 3 NIT appearances in 91, 95 and 97. And 4 times you made the NCAA tourney, which was 93, as we talked about, 1994, 96 and 98. Now, you alluded to it a little while ago, but in 1993, you made it to the Sweet 16 before finally bowing out, and it was only an 8-point game, 72-64, to Michigan's Fab 5.
Right.
Before I ask actually about a 1994 trip to Australia.
Yeah, there you go.
Do you mind reflecting on that amazing turnaround with GW and taking the team so far into that 1993 tournament particularly?
Once again, I had really good players who were totally committed to winning, guys who had been through some tough times before I went there, and they were hungry. And I had a great coaching staff, and we were very fortunate. We were able to recruit a young man from Nigeria by the name of Yinka Dare, who actually ended up being drafted in the first round by the New Jersey Nets.
Mm-hmm.
And Yinka was such a strong player. And I had good guards. Had a young man by the name of Dirk Searles and a great point guard named Alvin Pearsall. I had good forwards, Vaughn Jones, Sonny Holland. I had really good players, Nimbo Hammond. So we put it all together. We were one of the last teams selected for the tournament. We got a really good draw. We were the 12th seed. We played against New Mexico. We beat them. We're very fortunate that the higher seed, Georgia Tech, was upset. So we played a team that I think we would have beat 9 out of 10 times, Southern University, to go to the Sweet 16. And when we played against Michigan, our kids thought they could beat anybody, and Michigan jumped out to a big lead. We pressed them. We had a good chance to beat them. And that was the year that Chris Webber called the timeout against North Carolina. But what happened was, I want to say it was a 2-point game. We might have even taken the lead. And on 2 or 3 different occasions, their players went to the free throw line and missed the free throw, but they got the rebound and put it back in. That's how they beat us in that game, by getting rebounds off of their own missed free throws and putting them back in. Otherwise, it would have been maybe the greatest upset of all time in college basketball.
Oh, most certainly. What was the atmosphere like? The Fab Five were hyped beyond belief, and rightfully so. They had some fantastic players who, a majority of, I think 4 out of the 5 went on to be pros. Jalen Rose, Chris Webber, Juwan Howard, probably the three most recognisable, of course.
Oh, yeah.
What was that atmosphere like in the arena? The crowd, how was their reaction to your storming back and almost actually taking the victory?
They couldn't believe it. I mean, neither could the announcers. Billy Packer, the famous TV basketball announcer, basically he questioned CBS for putting our game on. He said it was going to be a massacre.
Oh, wow. I didn't know about that.
Yeah. I think we were down by about 17 points in the first half. And, we went there to try and win. So I said, you know what, guys, we're going to press them. We didn't really zone press much that year, but we put on the zone press. And I think we caught them off guard. They started to throw the ball away. We scored. And before you know it, there was a game going on. What I remember was there was 41,000 people in attendance in the Seattle Dome. And, in the NCAA tournament, the fans always loved the underdog. All the fans got behind us. So we had the whole place cheering us on. I mean, other than the people that were there from Michigan, they were stunned. They didn't expect it. Even though we lost the game, we felt like we won, and we were treated like we won. We became heroes and put the school on the map.
You more than held your own. It was only an 8-point game in the end, and March Madness is made for teams like yours that were storming their way through.
That's right.
I can only imagine how great it would have been to have been part of that. You did mention Yinka Dare, probably the most recognisable player from that period of time, at least he was to me, because that's how I knew of his name, was just through being part of George Washington. He averaged almost 14 points a game, 10 rebounds, and over 2 blocks a contest in 2 seasons with your Colonials, and then was drafted number 14 overall in the first round of the NBA draft in '94. He played for the New Jersey Nets, as you were saying.
Right.
Passed away at age just 31, which was really sad.
Yes.
Do you mind just elaborating a little bit more about your relationship with Yinka? Like, how was he off the court? What did you sort of make of the attention that came his way in the couple of seasons that he played with you?
Well, Yinka was one of the most gentle, kind people you ever want to meet. I mean, he spoke very, very softly. When he played, he played like Superman, but he was not a skilled player, but he was one of the strongest players that you would, every time he dunked the ball, the whole basket would shake. He dominated games because other players were afraid of him. But he didn't have the skill level to play at the next level. If he'd stayed in college another year or two, I think he would have. But when you have that kind of opportunity to make that kind of money, it's something that you take. Now, he played for one of my former players at Boston University. Scott Spinelli was coaching at Milford Academy. In fact, the main reason why I was able to recruit Yinka was because he was playing with Scott, who I had coached. So obviously I got a lot of help from Scott in the recruitment of Yinka. When he first came to the States to play in prep school, he couldn't play for more than 2 or 3 minutes before he'd have to come out the game because he was short of breath. And he thought he had a heart problem. So when he agreed to come to play for me, one of the first things I said that I would do was I would take him to meet with the cardiologist. We had an appointment with a heart specialist at Georgetown who examined Yinka, and come to find out he didn't have a heart problem. He had asthma.
Oh, okay.
He went from being a kid that couldn't practice for more than 3 minutes, 4 minutes at a time to a kid who could now go through 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours of practice just by basically using the inhaler. Now, later on, he had respiratory problems because I think he probably stopped regularly using his inhaler, and that led to other things. But it was incredible that this kid, like I said, who couldn't play for more than 2 or 3 minutes at a time, became one of the most dominant players in college basketball.
Yeah, that's some transformation. And again, thanks for opening up and sharing those details with us as well. I much appreciate it. Now, I did mention a little while ago, in May of 1994, you took your George Washington team to Australia.
Yes.
To play a series of exhibition games against some club teams, including the Melbourne Tigers.
Yes.
My memory's a little hazy. However, I definitely went to one of the games. I think it was at what was then called Flinders Park in Melbourne. I can't recall, though, if your game was part of a double header or not, because you were touring as well with another team called Marathon Oil.
Yes.
which was a combined team of US players.
Right.
Who were playing against our national team, the Australian Boomers. Do you remember much about that trip to Australia and what sort of impact it had on your team, even though it was just an off-season jaunt for you guys?
Well, it was a trip of a lifetime. I mean, Australia, in fact, my wife still talks about that trip. I think we started the trip in Adelaide. Of course, it took us, we traveled for like 26 hours. It's brutal, but it was worth it once we got there. And it was an incredible trip. My wife and I can't wait till we go back to Australia. Next time I go, though, I'm going to stay in Australia for at least 2 weeks and then go to New Zealand, I think.
Yeah.
It was a great trip. I don't know if we won any games. We may not have won a game. Competition was a little bit keen. Yinka was not on that trip. He didn't play with us. When we first set the trip up, the intention was for him to be on the team, but he went to the NBA draft. We were really shorthanded. We didn't have a real quality big guy. It wasn't until later that summer that we were able to get a young man who didn't go on that trip to play for us, Alexander Kool from Belarus, who was another 7-footer, and he ended up playing for us that next season. He didn't go to Australia either.
Your team continued to have great success post that trip to Australia and through 1998, as I was mentioning. And then you took on another challenge, a really big challenge, by moving to New York and taking over the helm of St. John's. That period of your career began in 1998-99, and then you're with St. John's through 2003-2004.
Right.
Again, you had some really good success at that period of time. In your first season there, you made it all the way to the Elite Eight in the NCAA tournament. You were the Big East champs in 2000 and then advanced to the round 2 of the tournament that same year. Now, however, 2003 came around and it certainly wasn't smooth sailing at that particular period of time. When you reflect on your years with St. John's, what sort of memories spring to mind there, Mike?
Well, first of all, overall, I mean, we had incredibly great success. We were in the NCAA tournament 3 out of the 5 years. We won the NIT. We went to the Elite Eight. And my best player actually had his worst game of his career in that game that we lost to Ohio State by 3. We should have really went to the Final Four. We were without our center, who had been hurt, and Ron didn't play well, but we still had a chance to go to the Final Four. And not too many coaches get to the Final Four, so I'll never forget that.
Absolutely not.
But it was an interesting time. I mean, St. John's, an interesting school, you know, going through a transition. You've got a lot of, you know, really hard-nosed kids who really compete. And what I remember most of all was that, I mean, we competed every night, and we had a chance to win probably 99% of our games. We just sometimes got beat by better teams. But during that tenure, we beat Duke a couple of times, once in Madison Square Garden, and the other time, in fact, Duke, the only non-league loss that they've had in the last 18 years was to us in February of 2000.
Wow.
We went into Cameron Indoor, and we beat Duke. And we beat Duke twice during my tenure. And we won an NIT championship where we beat Bobby Knight. In fact, our teams beat Bobby Knight in the NCAA and the NIT. So I don't think there's too many other coaches that can say that their team's 2-0 against Bobby Knight.
Very true.
Yeah. You know, there was controversy, you know, with the NCAA, Eric Barkley and some other college kids were being sort of hounded by the NCAA, and I think that had a lot to do with us losing in the second round the following year, because the year that we lost out in Arizona, we lost to Gonzaga, who really was playing a home game. It was a year of a lot of controversy surrounding not only Eric Barkley, but a handful of players from around the country that the NCAA was sort of, you know, hounding and investigating.
Some tumultuous times, but overall, certainly you enjoyed some tremendous success there at St. John's. And how did it feel to actually walk off Cameron Indoor Stadium and have the Cameron Crazies quieted for once? What was that feeling like?
Unlike anything else, number one, that is, I think, the best, the most incredible place to play in all of college basketball. And to go in there and do something that nobody else outside of the conference can do and to win, that's another thing. And then the other thing about that game that was so great, it was an early game. I want to say it was it was either 12 o'clock or maybe 2 o'clock game. So we not only won the game, but we were able to enjoy the replays for the whole day. And that's what made it even more special. And we didn't have charter planes, so we had to wait till the next day to come home. So we were able to enjoy that victory for about 24 hours. It was great.
That's fantastic. I love to hear that sort of stuff. How would the pressures of the New York fans compare to back when you were coaching in Massachusetts?
Well, the New York fans were great. I mean, especially if you're winning.
Yeah, they love their basketball too.
Everybody gambles on the basketball games, and when you're winning, everybody's making money.
True.
The fans were happy because we won most of our games. In New York, I mean, the fans are great. It's the newspapers, I mean, now our president talks about fake news. And we had a lot of fake news going on in sports in New York. I mean, I think the hardest part about coaching in New York is dealing with the media. It's almost maybe as difficult as being president, trying to deal with the media. That was the tough part, and it never really bothered me because I never thought I'd ever get fired, to be honest with you. I wasn't smart enough to realize that someday I, too, would get the axe. But it bothers your family, and particularly your wife. And in my case, it really bothered my wife when some of the fans weren't quite happy with what we were doing. They haven't experienced anything like what we did since we left. It really got to my wife. And it's probably a blessing that I did leave there. If I had stayed, I don't know if my wife would still be alive today. I mean, for her to be in the stands listening to people talk about her husband, that's one thing. But to be in the stands and have to listen to people talk about her husband and her son, that's a little bit too much for any woman to handle.
Oh, totally understandable there, and you make some very valid points for sure. After leaving St. John's, you stepped away from coaching and began work as a basketball analyst. I believe you also wrote a book. You were working as a motivational speaker, and I'm sure there's plenty of other things that you did amongst that time before returning to your last coaching gig, which we'll get to shortly. But if you don't mind, and you have been very generous with your time, so I'm wary of that, but thank you so much. What was that transition like, leaving coaching after so long and then moving into work away from the sidelines?
Well, it was tough. It was very, very difficult. It's something that most coaches who coached and taught as long as I did can never adjust to. But with the help of the good Lord and my wife and my family, I was able to make the transition. We moved to Florida. We found a church home. I was born again. I became a full-fledged Christian, joined a church, a small group. And I did go to work in basketball with ESPN and then eventually with Fox, beIN Sports. It's really funny. I never, ever loved the TV work. I was working initially in the studio. If I knew then what I know now, I would have held out for a analyst job at the games because that's what I enjoyed. That was probably the next best thing to coaching because I could coach from behind a microphone, behind a headset.
Right.
So I enjoyed that. I did not enjoy the studio. But what I did, and my wife helped me with this, she said, God has blessed you. He's given you all these incredible experiences, and you should share those. So she encouraged me to write a book initially, and then to speak and, to share stories that were relatable, that people could use for their own benefit. And then that led to a second book. The first book was Skills for Life, which was a life skills book. The second book was Everybody Needs a Head Coach. And now I'm working on my third book, which is The 7 C's of Leadership. It's evolved into basically giving me the ability to be able to not only speak about my life and about the basketball-related stories, but also try to teach people how to be, including myself, how to be better leaders and mentors and make better parents. The speaking thing, I would do here and there. When you're working as a basketball analyst doing games, you have one game, but it really takes 3 days out of the week, a day to travel, a day to do the game, and then another day to travel back home.
Yep.
So you don't have a whole lot of time. It's been over the last 2 years particularly that I have been able to really devote more time speaking, and I'm hoping to do even more of that in the years to come if the good Lord will keep me around for a while.
That sounds great, and I'm sure you'll be around for plenty more years to come. How did you find the process of writing those first 2 books? Was it something that came to you quite naturally, or was there quite a bit of work behind the scenes to get the ideas together to then come onto the page? How did that sort of work?
Well, you know what? One thing I've always been able to do is to work with really good people, to recruit really good people. So the first book, Skills for Life, I did that book with a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Peck, who has passed away, who helped me set up an advisory group with the young players at Boston University when I was coaching there. And that led to us writing a book about the things we were trying to teach them about the various life skills, how to get along with people, how to communicate, how to look, how to act, all that kind of stuff, how to dress. That was the first book. The second book, I met a young writer by the name of Chad Bonham years ago, and I contributed to a couple of books he was writing about legendary coach John Wooden. So I got to really like this guy. And my wife and I, after our time at Florida Atlantic was over in 2014, went on a cruise with some Christian men and women. We followed the footsteps of the Apostle Paul through Greece onto Israel. And during that trip, I was encouraged by a lot of the older gentlemen to write a book. And my wife said, yes, you should. So when I got home, I called Chad Bonham and I said, Chad, we're going to write a book together. And so he came to Florida. We sat by the ocean one day. I started to just tell him about all these different stories and different people like you and I have talked about, whether it be Michael Jordan or Red Auerbach or Sad Sanders or what have you, so the experiences at GW and St. John's and BU. So we went through maybe about 50 different stories. And that's when we decided that we would do a book called Everybody Needs a Head Coach. There were 23 chapters in the book. Every one is about something that everybody needs. So we did that. The first 2 books sort of like gave me the impetus to try and maybe do a book on leadership and mentoring. And that's why I'm doing the 7 C's of leadership. And I'm also developing a leadership course that people will be able to take as a college elective or even just as an enrichment course on leadership using the 7 C's of leadership as the book.
You're a very busy man, Mike. You must enjoy being on the go, which is a good quality to have.
Well, it's what keeps me going. I mean, to be very honest with you, my mom lived to 98, and she was doing crossword puzzles until the day she died. I was always taught that have a chance of living a long life, you have to stay busy and you have to keep the mind active. And that's what I'm trying to do. You should always do it doing something that you love. I have a passion about the life that God has given me, and I'm just trying to share it.
Yeah, absolutely. Your last stop as head coach commenced in 2008. We have mentioned it a few times, Florida Atlantic, where you spent 6 seasons. In 2011, you were the regular season champions and made it to the National Invitational Tournament. How did you enjoy the return to coaching, and what was it like to get back in and be a leader of the young men again on and off the court?
It was challenging. I mean, it was probably the toughest job I ever had because Florida, with very few exceptions, is not a basketball state. It's a football state. The school I coached at had no basketball history or tradition. In fact, the first league championship they ever won was the year that we won it. The resources really are not there for basketball. The facility is average at best. So it was very, very difficult job. We did get some good players. I think if I had scheduled differently, we would have won a lot more games, but I always believed in scheduling up, and I'd rather play and lose to a really good team than beat a bad team.
Mm-hmm.
We played a lot of teams that we probably shouldn't have been playing, but we did that. We gave a lot of teams that were a lot more talented than us and had much more resources some pretty good games, but If I had stayed there another couple of years, I think I would have won 100 games there. But that wasn't to be, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I was still there. So I thank God for the opportunity to get in and to get out.
Well, it sounds like it was a trying scenario. And also making the NIT tournament to the first round, that's an impressive achievement, particularly given the background of the school at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely have some positives to take away for sure. You are a member of the Cambridge High School, Massachusetts Coaches, New England Coaches Association, and George Washington University Hall of Fames. Just looking back at your life as a coach and in basketball in general, what do they mean to you?
Well, you know what they mean to me? They mean, number one, I've lived a long life. I've been blessed tremendously with really good players, with great players, with really, really good, great assistants. I have the most incredible wife and family in the world. Just talking with you for the last hour, there used to be a show on television called This Is Your Life.
Yeah, I know the one.
That's what we just did. You went through basically my life. The only thing we didn't talk about was when I was a little boy just starting into sports. But this conversation just makes me realize how blessed I am and how fortunate I am. Even though I know in my own mind I could coach tomorrow and be very, very good at it. But that's not what the good Lord had in mind. He's got me right where he wants me to be, and he's got me doing what I'm doing.
That's great to hear. I love to ask a question of my guests. Basketball Digest had a regular feature which was called The Game I'll Never Forget.
Right.
We may have already chatted about it. Is there a particular game from your career across any of the levels that stands out the most?
Oh, wow. A game I'll never forget.
You've probably coached in tens of them, so...
Yeah, I have, but we talked about the games that I'll never forget. First of all, as a player, I'll never forget the championship game in high school and riding the fire engines. I'll never forget the first time we won a state championship in high school. That was a season that everybody expected us to go undefeated, and we did. And I remember running into the locker room, screaming and yelling, and, oh, this is great. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me that it was an empty feeling. And the empty feeling came up over me because I realized that tomorrow, the next day, we were not going to be practicing. So it was almost like there was a big letdown. So I remember that. And obviously I remember that run out to the Sweet 16. I remember our run to the Elite Eight. The Duke win at Cameron. I mean, it's funny. I guess if I had to pick one game, I don't know what game it would be, to be very honest with you. It wasn't the Big East Championship, even though it could have been. I don't know. I would have to think about that. Right now, I'm going to say those are the games. Okay.
Totally understandable and acceptable. It's just something I like to throw out there and see what the answer comes back at. And it speaks volumes, though, for all the things that you've done with teams and players and individuals across such a diverse period of time and places as well. I'd like to ask what jersey numbers players wore when they were playing in their career. As far as I can tell, you wore number 31 at Northeastern. Was there any significance to the jersey number 31?
I think that was the only number they had left. In high school, I had number 21.
Okay.
Once again, it was like, yeah, here's your uniform. In those days, players didn't pick their numbers. They just got a uniform if they were lucky. And it's just like when Patrick played in high school, he wore number 32. Why? I don't know. I guess that number was available. Also, it was the size that could fit. I think we got numbers according to the uniform that would fit us.
Gotcha. Returning back to almost the start of our conversation, you mentioned Bill Russell playing a game against the Philadelphia Warriors. I've had a quick look on basketballreference.com, which is a great website.
Yes.
Just after Christmas Day in 1956, he had a 15-point, 34-rebound game.
34. See, don't tell anybody it was only 34. I always tell people he got 40 rebounds that night.
That's incredible.
It is incredible.
That was on the 26th of December of 1956.
Day after Christmas. In fact, I'll remember now, you said 34. I'm going to have to remember that. I'm going to try to give the correct number. Instead of saying he had 40 rebounds, I'll say he had 34. All right.
34 is still mighty impressive.
Unbelievable.
That draws a bow on a conversation which I couldn't have enjoyed any further. So thank you again, Mike, for taking the time to chat with me, and I look forward to sharing the conversation and send it out there for all to enjoy.
Listen, when the day comes when you're ready to produce and direct the Mike Jarvis story, let me know. We have a movie that we could make that I think, honestly, and I mean, there's some stories that we didn't even have a chance to talk about that would make great movie. So you never know. Someday we might be doing a movie together, or at least, or maybe you'll be in a theater watching my life on the big screen, you know?
I'd love to, in either way, have some sort of involvement, whether it's helping out or at least watching the final product.
Yeah.
We've had to skip over some topics, but I can't thank you enough for your time. I hope you enjoyed reliving your career.
I thank you. I look forward to seeing you again on my return to Australia, okay?
By all means, please let me know. I'd definitely love to catch up and meet you in person.
I will. Okay, well, thank you, and now we're friends for life, all right?
Indeed. I love it. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, God bless you. Take care of yourself.
Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. You can suggest topics or guests you want to hear conversations with. You can leave a voicemail. Simply visit inallairness.com/voice, click start recording, leave a message and press stop. You can even listen back before submitting. Press send and you're done. Worldwide, the show currently has 73 reviews, 70 on iTunes and 3 on Stitcher. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Your word-of-mouth recommendations are truly worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my monthly email newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming podcast episodes, future high-profile guests to appear on the show, and much more. Simply visit inallairness.com/news. You can subscribe to my show in various ways. Apple Podcasts, visit inallairness.com/iTunes. Android, visit inallairness.com/Android. Add it to your Stitcher playlist, inallairness.com/Stitcher. And you can now subscribe to the show on Spotify, plus Pocket Casts, Player FM, TuneIn Radio, other podcatchers, and of course via the Podcasts app on your iOS device of choice. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter @inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.